Once again, good morning. And I say this mostly to the bell, the makugyo, the altar, the bowl, the incense, the candle, the zafus and zabutons, the sunlight coming in through the window, and the Buddha statue with its smile that matches the Mona Lisa. Once upon a time, in the year 1993 or so, I was standing at a bus stop in the pouring rain in Dublin, and something wonderful happened. Before going into what that wonderful thing was, I'd like to take a little journey. They say that, I've heard it said, that patience is a virtue. And I would like to suggest that not only is it a virtue, it's a really good strategy. If you want to take Dharma Mountain by strategy, patience is a good strategy. In the 1700s, particularly in the second half, Britain had formulated a very simple strategy that the best way to secure its security and prosperity was to ensure that it had the undisputed best naval force in the world. And that very simple strategy proved successful. The old saying, Britannia rules the waves, proved to be a complete success until the rise of aviation. Then the strategy had to change. So our journey with Captain Bligh, Lieutenant Bligh, was part of that strategy. Now you may think that the world of the bounty was vastly different to the world we live in today. And in many ways, it is. But this book that I read a few years ago, well, actually I didn't read the book. I'm fascinated by the book. Came across it on Kindle and downloaded it. The Decline of the West by a German philosopher named Spengler, whom I had never heard of before. I think I only got about 20 pages into it and decided it was good enough to actually give it some serious time and set time aside to study it. But I haven't gotten around to that yet. And I've since learned that Spangler is all over the place, and that the best strategy, if you want to understand him, is to read a very edited version of his work. So I downloaded the original a few years ago for 99 cents or something. Still, in those first 20 pages or so, I could get the gist of his argument. And the gist of his argument is that cultures arise and cease, but they go through a life cycle. They're born, they persist, and then they subside. And he wrote this just over 100 years ago. And from his perspective, having looked at ancient cultures around the world, China, India, Egypt, Greece, Rome, he concluded or suggested that the West 100 years ago was already in decline. He also said that it was a great mistake to think of Western culture as somehow being a continuation of ancient Greece, ancient Greek culture, or ancient Roman culture. Those cultures declined and deceased. And our culture of today, well, actually, we don't have a culture today, according to Spangler. We have a civilization. And a civilization is the end of a culture. So a culture is the creative force where new insights arise, new values arise, new perspectives arise, and these are the cultural norms. They have a surge or a growth, and then there is the kind of cessation of the creativity, and the civilization that follows is keeping those cultural perspectives and norms. And all cultures go through this cycle, according to Spangler. But the difference between us and Lieutenant Bligh and the crew on the Bounty is less than the difference between the crew on the Bounty and the civilization or culture that produced it and ancient Greece. And he gives a number of reasons for this, but the main reason, just to take one example, is in the realm of mathematics. It turns out that the Greeks would not entertain the notion of zero or infinity. These numbers or these symbols are missing. So when I was watching on Netflix their miniseries on the Roman Empire, I was curious if the same was true of Rome. And I couldn't think of a Roman numeral representing zero. So I looked it up on Wikipedia, and it's true. They did not have a number 0. What Spangler was saying about the Greeks is that they deliberately excluded 0 from their mathematics. Not as though they hadn't discovered it, they deliberately excluded it, and their whole emphasis was on the concrete, not on the abstract. Their art, music, it's all to do with the concrete. Now, other cultures had embraced 0 and infinity. I think he mentions Egypt and India. So their exclusion of 0 and infinity is a cultural perspective, a cultural value. They also had a lot of problems with irrational numbers, numbers that go on forever and ever and ever, or seemingly so. And they believed that there must be a termination point, just that they couldn't find it. So it must have been a source of perplexity and anxiety for them to be presented with the circle, which is a symbol of perfection and completion, and yet it produces pi, that irrational number. So, years before, I was standing at the bus stop. Years before that, I had read a book called The Birth of a New Physics. And I'm pretty sure that's where the idea that I'm leading to came from, in reading The Birth of a New Physics. The author described how different the physics, even of the 1500s in Europe, were different from the physics of ancient Greece. The main difference was this willingness to test our ideas. An example, the ancient Greeks believed that the world was stationary, that it was not moving through space. And the evidence that they cited was that if you throw a ball up, it lands at your feet. If the world was moving, they argued, it would land somewhere else because the world had moved. Point is that this hypothesis, or this understanding, was very testable, and they didn't test it. Take yourself, for instance. If you happen to be sitting on a train with an orange in your hand and you throw it up, it lands in your hand. They had chariots and they had boats. They could test this hypothesis. And then later, in the 1500s, the Europeans, they did test this hypothesis and found that it wasn't actually true. Yes, it lands at your feet when you throw a ball up on the earth, but it does the same thing if you're in a ship or if you are in a moving carriage. So So that was the emergence of a different understanding of the world and a different approach to that understanding. Copernicus had a great idea that the planets actually go around the sun. But it was other people like Galileo and Newton who actually gathered the evidence to support that idea. So in this way, the world of the 1700s was very different to the world of ancient Greece and Rome. And this strategy to rule the waves, or to have the undisputed strongest naval force in the world, proved to be very successful. And it wasn't without some defeats and without some mistakes. Some people have been wondering, could anything have gone differently for the crew on the Bounty? And I can't help thinking that maybe the mistake that was made was right at the beginning. The Admiralty purchased a collier, a ship that had been built for transporting coal. And they purchased it just for this mission, to go to Tahiti, get breadfruit, and bring it to the Caribbean. And when they bought this ship, they didn't like the name. It didn't fit with the mission. So they changed the name. And I have, on numerous occasions, heard it said, you should never change the name of a boat or of a ship. And maybe if they had not changed the name, there would not have been a mutiny. After all, mutiny on the Bethia doesn't quite sound as romantic or attractive as mutiny on the Bounty. So this book, The Birth of a New Physics, traces the development of physics into the 20th century and into quantum mechanics. And the author, I forget who the author is or was, describes something of the process about discoveries in physics, particularly in the last 100 years or so, and how the observed data would conflict with current understanding, and so a resolution had to be sought, an understanding that reconciled or brought in the new observed data. So in this way, our understanding of the universe, or at least our part of it, increases. in describing that process, they described what they call the 3 B's. Not the bumblebees kind of thing, but the B is in the alphabet. The 3 B's: the bed, the bath, and the bus. And it's in these 3 B's that great physics insights have taken place. Now, obviously, it's not simply being in the bath or being on the bus or being in bed. Otherwise, we'd all be having great physics insights. And maybe the shower is just as good as the bath. The point that the author was making is that the physicist, or sometimes the chemist or the mathematician, would spend years, possibly, trying to come up with a model or a theory that would include the present data, which was contradicting the previous theory. They'll spend years working out mathematical formulae, mathematical equations, trying to hypothesize a theory that would include the new data. And after years, or possibly only months, but usually years, of concentrating, focusing, digging into this problem, something would click while they're on a bus, or while they're in the bath, or while they're in bed. In other words, and usually I think it was while they were getting into or out of the bath, into or out of bed, into or out of the bus. And it's this process of doing something completely ordinary, completely banal. And in that moment, there's an opening for an insight to come through. Whereas the previous time spent in concentration and digging into it, that activity, in a sense, prevented the insight, but in another sense, developed the ground for that insight. So the idea then is, if you want to develop some kind of insight, you dig into it repeatedly, thoroughly, consistently, and then forget about it. And it's in that forgetting about it that the answer can come up. So as I waited in the pouring rain, and I'd like to say why I was waiting in the pouring rain. I was under a shelter. I had moved out of my house on the outskirts of Dublin to rent a flat closer to the Dublin Meditation Centre, and to move into the same apartment building that the teacher was living in. And it was about a 20-minute walk to the meditation center. But on this occasion, just as I left the building, it began to rain, and very quickly it became a downpour. So I decided I would wait for a bus. And the bus was taking quite a while to get there. I was really thinking, maybe I should just start walking again and arrive soaking wet. I don't know, I can't really do that. So I'll wait, continue to wait, and maybe I'll arrive on time. And then as I settled into the waiting, I had this realization that tomorrow would be just the same as this, except that instead of stepping onto a bus, I'd be stepping onto a boat or a ship to sail over to Holyhead and to a retreat centre in Wales. So this is often described as a beginning of insight where you see the sameness of all things. And we may know that everything is the same. We may have an understanding that today is the same as yesterday and tomorrow will be the same as today. But there's a point where you realize it. There's a point where that sinks in, where it becomes a reality, which is why I like the word to have a realization, where a concept you have of the world becomes real. And that's what happened. It was like the penny dropped, or an aha moment, where you're open enough to let it sink in. It's from there that I realized it's always the same. We're always just moving our hands and feet around. In the words of the Metta Sutta, whether sitting, standing, walking, or lying down, all our activities are a variation of this, or a combination of these things. You could add in thinking. You're usually thinking about something, or you're not thinking about something, but your thoughts are drifting. Feeling, there's usually some kind of feeling going on. You're in a situation, there's either somebody near you or there isn't. So this realization that tomorrow would be the same, except that in stepping onto a bus, I would be stepping onto a boat. But it's still the activity of stepping onto something. And that's what our lives consist of. Moving our hands and feet, putting them in certain positions. Again, we can have some kind of intellectual understanding of this, but there comes a point where it sinks in and you realize that it is so. Patience. How could we define patience? And I don't want to take up a book comparable to Plato's Republic trying to define justice. But as a starting point, patience could be defined, perhaps, as managing the tension between here and there. We are here, but we want to be there. There's a certain tension in that. Managing that tension, or experiencing that tension, but not acting on it. Or perhaps patience is simply the ability to defer gratification, to say later. Again, it's this ability to withstand the pressure to go there, mentally or physically. Another way to look at this is impatience. Impatience, you cannot stand the pressure to move mentally or physically from here to there. And usually, I think, we only call it impatience when it begins to noticeably manifest in our body. Now, maybe that you call it impatience, even though it has not noticeably manifested in your body. That it's manifesting noticeably in your mind or in your brain. And that could be seen as part of your body. So if you're feeling impatient, again, ask yourself, where do you feel it? Where is that feeling manifesting? So impatience is when the urge to move from where you are to where you want to be, which is also getting something that you want. When that urge is tangible and can barely be contained. So I'm saying that patience is the ability to manage or to contain that tension. It's a wonderful strategy if what you want to do is to see things as it really is. Because the compulsive acting on impulse, or the anxious driven activity of trying to get where you want to be or what you want to have, blinds you to seeing things as it really is. So one way to practice patience is to be patient. But to explore this feeling, this tension of wanting to be there when you are actually here. And in so doing, in exploring that feeling, in feeling that feeling, we become more here than there. And in the manifestation of patience, we are prepared to wait until things happen seamlessly. That is, they happen as a perfect fit, not forced, not arrived at by bullying or by gross manipulation, which would be indicated with the precepts. But they happen seamlessly. It's a little bit like a frog sitting on a rock, perfectly still, until a fly is within range. I'm not too sure how defensible that metaphor is. But it's this: I'll wait for what I want until the time is right. The ability to wait indefinitely, that's a really big one. Because if you're willing to wait indefinitely, do you really want the thing you think you want? As we go through sesshin, or practice period, and a sesshin, and then another practice period and sesshin, this ability to sit still deepens and keeps getting deeper. And we become, therefore, sensitive to any fluctuations of wanting to be there instead of here. It's like the leaf that moves in the wind, or the gold leaf that moves in the wind. It moves in the slightest of breezes. We become sensitive to that slightest variation. We become sensitive to the faintest stirring of looking forward to something. And it becomes instantly containable. We become instantly back to where we are, right here, right now. Because in this moment, there is the totality. There is the whole. And by staying in the whole, things happen seamlessly, without force, without contrivance, without manipulation. In this, we're approaching the perfection of patience, or the way I like to think of it, the culmination of patience, or the completion of patience. As your ability to wait and contain expands to include more and more possibilities and more situations, the boundaries of those situations dissolve. And the desire to be there is so much part of the present that you don't really desire to be there. You experience that desire as a present moment totality, or part of that present moment totality. Living here in relative isolation, as much as you can be isolated with video conference calls, telephone calls, emails, work on the computer, living here still in relative isolation, every so often I notice this sense of loneliness or vulnerability. And there's one part of me that reaches out, maybe it would be good to have somebody to live with. And then the other part of me reaches into that feeling and says, oh, that's interesting. That feeling manifests now. Feel it. And then it passes. As all feelings do. But it makes me think that maybe other people feel this too. Feel this possible loneliness, possible vulnerability. It's more that we're becoming aware, perhaps, of how vulnerable life is. Imagine a friend goes into a shop and brings out to you an ice cream cone with a chocolate flake in it. And you receive it with a smile on your face, grateful, and really set to enjoy it. And a passerby bumps into you and it goes flat on the ground. Does patience kick in? Does your practice of patience realize the opportunity of just seeing the scene as it is? Or does anger kick in? And you're angry with the person who bumped into you? Does disappointment kick in? And you feel a sense of loss for what you are about to enjoy? When presented with a catastrophe, when presented with a crisis, a sudden turnaround of events, what do you do? How long does it take you to regain your balance? I think in Zen mind, beginner's mind, Suzuki Roshi says, we are always losing our balance against a background of perfect balance. So how long does it take you to reconnect with the background? Founder of Aikido, if I can say his name correctly, Ushiba Morihei, founder of Aikido, said, it's not that I never lose my balance. I just regain it very quickly. If it's hard for you to regain your balance when presented with a sudden misfortune, how much more difficult is it for a child? And perhaps it is the child within us that finds it difficult to regain the balance. And many teachers say that spiritual practice is about growing up. It's about becoming mature to the reality in which we live, facing our situation square on. I remember as a child being given a balloon, and the balloon had a cartoon on it. I don't ever recall seeing this cartoon on TV or relating to it outside of that balloon. But the cartoon had a name, Pinky and Perky. And, well, pleasures were simple back then. And I think I was 2 or 3. And there was a gathering either in our house or the house next door. And people used to smoke at these gatherings. And a cigarette came in contact with my balloon. And it was gone. And I was unhappy with that situation. So I started to cry. And somebody said to me, a grown-up, an adult, said, "Don't worry, we'll get you another one." That only made the situation worse. I don't know if I said it or thought it. Definitely thought it. I don't know if I actually said it. I don't want another one. I want that one. Two things from this recollection as I meditated upon patience. Yes, there's the child's inability to deal with sudden changes of events. And part of growing up is learning how to deal with it. But another thing that comes from that memory is the adult. The adult trying to address the child's frustration or grief and missing the mark. And I know they missed the mark because I was the child. But it's a lesson for me and for other adults who may be missing the mark. You cannot be placated by just getting a copy of what you had, because the grief is not only to do with the loss of what you had, but your grief is to do with the fact that you can lose what you have. The grief, the frustration, the anger is to do with our realization that the world you have and know can be taken away. And replacing what you've lost with something else doesn't take away that shock, doesn't address that shock. How do you address that shock? As adults and as practitioners, we come to terms with impermanence. We settle into the reality of our undesirable predicament. When it comes to children, I feel as though we need to address the underlying issue and not simply try to give them something that we think they want, but to recognize that their reaction has more to do with the fact that things can change so drastically. How do you address that? Well, one thing is to share that you know that things are like that, and that it's very hard to come to terms with it. And that it's important that we come to terms with it, because there's no real way out of it. So patience, waiting for what you want, waiting for the right time, waiting for the timing to be right so that it happens gracefully or seamlessly. Seamlessly is a nice word. It happens without borders or boundaries. When it happens, it's a perfect fit. It seems to grow rather than be made. And the culmination of this practice, the perfection of this practice, is the completion of this practice. I tend to see the 6 perfections as the 6 completions. When something is complete, it's complete, it's perfect, it's whole. Learning to sit, to feel the impulses, mental or physical, that want to take us away from where we are to somewhere else. To sit with those impulses and recognize them for what they are. They then draw us deeper into the present, because they act as little alarm bells at first, tinkle bells, bringing us back to the present. But if we fall into their grip, they will take us away from the present. Their boundary becomes stronger. And ultimately, in the present, there are no boundaries. I'd like to add an announcement, I suppose. These talks, I think this is number 9 of the COVID-19 series, and hitherto they've been on Sunday. So this is the halfway mark, except for one. And the next one is the pivot point. So my intention is that talk number 10 will be on a Wednesday. And then the remainder talks will be on a Saturday. Now, as I'm talking mostly to the bell, the mukugyo, the altar, the candle, the flowers, the statue, the incense bowl, zafus and zabutons, it doesn't really affect them because they're going to be here anyway. And you listening, it doesn't really affect you, except that there'll be an extra talk during the week, which you can listen to at the weekends, or the talk will be on Saturday instead of Sunday, but you can still listen to it on Sunday because, well, Saturday comes before Sunday, but you can still listen to it on Sunday. Okay. And in the meantime, we can practice patience, patient attention. Which would you rather live in? The world of Lieutenant Bligh and the Bounty, the world of Tahiti and paradise, the world of ancient Greece or ancient India. Incidentally, yes, I did say India did have zeros and infinities. Or the world that you're in now, with all its conflicts and difficulties and crises. This is the world in which we live. And maybe a little bit of patience will go a long way. Thank you all very much.